James McKerrow, the Kilmarnock blacksmith's son who had a huge impact on the naming of the southern New Zealand landscape. James McKerrow was born at Kilmarnock in the Scottish Lowlands in 1834, the eldest child in a family of 10. His father was a blacksmith here at Beansburn on the north side of the town. James received an excellent education locally at the Kilmarnock Academy, a school that would later produce Nobel laureate Alexander Fleming, who discovered penicillin. He then went on to study at Glasgow University before returning to Kilmarnock and joining his father in the smithy, manufacturing agricultural implements. But for a young man as clever as James, joining his father permanently at this ancient craft back in his hometown was never likely to provide sufficient scope for his youthful ambitions. McKerrow had grown up with stories about New Zealand, and neighbours from Kilmarnock had actually gone early to Otago's new church settlement. So it was no great surprise, perhaps, when he decided to emigrate there too. On the 5th of August 1859, he married a local dairymaid, Martha Dunlop, and just 3 weeks later, the young couple set sail from London on the Cheviot for Otago. On arrival, Martha got work as a domestic servant, and James got a job in the country not far from Dunedin. But the Otago Survey Office was crying out for surveyors in 1859, and James, having excelled at mathematics in university, decided to apply for a job there as an assistant surveyor. He had no trouble passing a tough written examination from John Turnbull Thompson, who was impressed when McKerrow got every question right. He quickly proved a highly competent surveyor and earned a reputation for meticulous fieldwork on his surveys around the Dunedin district. He worked with Thompson on the triangulation of Otago and Southland, a landmark survey exercise that made Otago's survey system the best in New Zealand and the model for a national system. He also undertook long expeditions inland and around the southern lakes. This was arduous pioneering work, but it also gave McKerrow the privilege of naming many features of the landscapes that he explored. His boss, Thompson, had personally surveyed most of the province east of the Lakes District, but realised that the vast areas west and south of this would require a younger man's energies. James McKerrow, a surveyor for only 2 years at that time, was given the task of filling in this vast gap in the map of Otago, almost a third of the province. It was both a huge challenge and a great opportunity. Between December 1861 and October 1863, McKerrow completed epic reconnaissance surveys of over 4 million acres. The first expedition went up the Shag Valley, across Cylinders Pass, down the Cardrona Valley, then over the mountains to Mount Nicholas Station. Next, McKerrow and his team surveyed lakes Hawea, Wanaka and Wakatipu. They walked to the foot of Mount Aspiring and they traced the forks of the Matukituki River in search for what later became known as the Haast Pass. They didn't find it and walked back out through the Dunstan in 9 inches of snow. Their final reconnaissance went up the Waiau River to Lakes Manapouri and Te Ano. As both explorer and surveyor, McKerrow was responsible for bestowing over 225 of the names that appear on modern maps of Otago and Southland. He explained his naming principles in 1907 to Dr. Hocken. First of all, he retained all Maori names that he was aware of. Mountain ranges, he chose distinguished men from science, travel, literature, or who occupied prominent positions of the day, such as Kepler, Humboldt and Eglinton. Otherwise, he picked prominent Otago men, such as his boss, J.T. Thompson, or the scientist, James Hector. A great number of simply descriptive names were given, such as Twin Peaks, the Minarets, or Coronet Peak. He also recognised his hard-working assistants, John Goldie and John Bryce, with Goldie Hill and Bryce Burn, while his own name appears in several places. McKerrow also brought names from Ayrshire, Doon, Dean Hill and Afton among them, while Beans Burn, a stream draining into the Dart River, immortalises his home in Kilmarnock. Mount Pisgah, from the summit of which McKerrow was the first to sight the west coast from Otago, was named for the biblical mountain from which Moses saw the promised land.
Having proven his competence with what were later described as astonishingly correct observations, McKerrow rose steadily through the ranks, becoming Chief Surveyor of Otago in 1873, and then Assistant Surveyor General in Wellington under his old Otago boss, J.T. Thompson, in 1876.
In 1879, he succeeded Thompson to become Surveyor General and served 10 years as the country's senior surveying bureaucrat. He also served in senior civil service roles as the Chief Commissioner of Railways and Chairman of the Board of Land Purchase Commissioners. Like many 19th century Scots, McKerrow was a keen amateur scientist of great ability. His observations of the transit of Venus from the Wellington Observatory in 1882 saw him elected a Fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society the following year. His geological studies in New Zealand, especially regarding glaciation, likewise saw him elected a Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society.
McKerrow was a devout Presbyterian who played an active part in church affairs, particularly its land investments. He's also remembered as a great companion, always happy to share a story from his detailed knowledge of the New Zealand landscape. He is in fact a classic example of that stock Scottish figure, the lad of parts. Someone who built on a solid education to develop a successful career that saw him scale the heights of the colonial civil service. In 1903, he returned to Scotland for a visit and was entertained by the town's Lord Provost at a banquet in Kilmarnock some 44 years after his departure from the town to seek his fortune in the colonies. It was a triumphal homecoming for the former apprentice blacksmith, who was now internationally recognised for his achievements in science and public service. Later on, Otago historian A.H. McClintock described McKerrow's pioneering surveys as a superlative achievement.
McKerrow's wife Martha died in Wellington in 1910. 3 years later, James married Emma Ruck before dying himself in 1919, aged 85. He was survived by the two daughters he had had with Martha.